Okay, good evening everybody, and you're very welcome to the latest in our series of Grand Challenge lectures. So we're delighted tonight to welcome to Kiel Melissa Benn, who's going to speak to the topic, Can Women Ever Win in Politics? Reflections on the centenary of women's suffrage. So this is a lecture we've been very much looking forward to, so you're very, very welcome, Melissa. So just to welcome you all again, here we are at the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences, and tonight's lecture has been organised in collaboration with colleagues who've been working very hard over many years now on Athena Swan submissions and processes, and Professor Susan Bruce, who's co-chair of the Kiel EDI group, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion group, will be contributing to this welcome, so I'll hand over to Susan in a moment. A couple of very brief housekeeping points. If the fire alarm goes off, the fire exit doors are to the right, and you will need to assemble behind Kiel Hall in the Italianate Gardens. Hopefully it won't happen. Do we think it's going to happen? No? So if it does happen, we do that, okay? The toilets are around the corner in the reception area. So Melissa Benn, pleasure to introduce Melissa, will be very known to many of you as a writer, journalist, broadcaster and campaigner. She was educated at Holland Park Comprehensive and the London School of Economics, where she graduated with a first-class honours in history. Before becoming a full-time writer, she worked for the National Council for Civil Liberties, the Open University, Women in Prison and the London magazine City Limits. Her writing appears in a wide range of publications, including The Independent, The Times, Public Finance, Marxism Today, the London Review of Books, Cosmopolitan, and Public Finance, a wide range of publications. She's a regular contributor to The Guardian and New Statesman. Melissa can also be heard contributing regularly on radio, including Radio 4's Today programme, Woman's Hour, Saturday Live, A Good Read, Richard and Judy, The Sky Book Show, and the Sky News programmes. She's spoken at the Hay, Edinburgh, Bath and Cheltenham literary festivals, among many others. Melissa has also published 8 books, including 2 novels, and her non-fiction work includes School Wars, The Battle for Britain's Education, which was 2011, and What Should We Tell Our Daughters? The Pleasures and Perils of Growing Up Female in 2013. She is a passionate and tireless campaigner for comprehensive education, a founder member of the local schools network, a vice president of the Socialist Education Association, and is current chair of Comprehensive Future, an all-party group committed to the phasing out of selection at 11 and the implementation of fair school admissions. In her more recent book, Life Lessons, published this year, she argues the case for a national education service. So I'm going to hand over now to Susan, who'd like to say a few words of her own.
Thank you, Shane. It's a great pleasure to be able to say a few words of introduction here. But I decided to start off by saying not something about Melissa, but something that I think Melissa would quite like. I've been away on sabbatical this semester, but I've been following on Twitter a new initiative from some of our students here at Kiel called Women of Kiel Educate, acronym WOKE. They've been putting on a series of events and talks by women and using the hashtag #SheShouldRunKiel. I felt very heartened by this, even though thus far I've only been watching from the sidelines. I think it's so good to see intersectional feminist activism alive and kicking on one's home turf. So I wanted at the outset to pay this little tribute to the energetic women, Sophia Tahar, Kieran Cower, Ellie Fisher and Roxy Birdsall, who have developed this initiative, and remark that the hashtag, especially She Should Run Kiel, is so appropriate for this talk. So if anybody in the audience is tweeting about Melissa's talk, I commend that hashtag to the House. So Melissa's talk today, as some of you may know, was originally scheduled for International Women's Day week. And this year, 2018, is, of course, the 100th anniversary of at least some women gaining suffrage in Great Britain, with the passing of the Representation of the People Act. Women who were both over 30 and relatively wealthy, either in their own right or by marriage, and all graduates of British universities, achieved the right to vote. Melissa was originally scheduled to come and speak then in a celebration both of International Women's Day and of the passing of the Representation of the People's Act, but her earlier visit happened to fall during the UCU strike, so it was postponed until today. However, early December is just as good in commemorative terms because the Parliament Qualification of Women Act was passed on the 21st of November 2018, allowing women to stand for Parliament, and women voted in a general election for the first time on the 14th of December 2018. So I'm just as delighted to welcome Melissa to Kiel today as I would have been back in March. Melissa has written very movingly of the difficulties women still experience in the 21st century, first in Madonna and Child, towards the new politics of motherhood, and more recently in What Shall We Tell Our Daughters, the Pleasures and Pressures of Growing Up Female, in which she details the ways in which women still have to save themselves by playing the feminine game in a culture too frequently marked by cruel, casual misogyny, and says at the outset of that book that we need to acknowledge both to ourselves and to our daughters. I actually don't have any daughters myself, sadly, but sometimes I like to think of students as kind of like surrogate or virtual daughters. So to acknowledge to them and ourselves how far feminism has brought us and how much it has changed the world, and also how far we still have to go. We need to encourage our daughters, she says, to stand up and stand out and to enter the political sphere, and I'm going to quote from her here. Politics of whatever kind is an art and a habit, she says, that needs to be cultivated. Enlightening and potentially affirming, it reminds us of our common humanity and provides a space for personal relationships that challenge the empty values of our time. We must not leave politics or public discussion to our fathers, husbands, brothers or sons, but encourage our daughters too to speak up and speak out. In her Grand Challenge lecture tonight, Melissa will reflect on women's achievements and progress in politics over the last 100 years, highlighting the fresh challenges that we face and pointing towards ways ahead for ensuring a more effective and inclusive politics. So please, I would like you to join with me now in extending a really warm welcome to Melissa so that she can speak out to us about these things.
Thank you, both of you. I do like these introductions. They make me sound quite interesting. And the quote that you used from the book, I hadn't realised I'd written it, and that sounded quite good as well. So look, I'm really delighted to be here. I was supposed to come in March, and I'm here in December. But actually, I think it's good that I'm here in December because we're at the end of a centenary year, an anniversary marking, as Susan said, 100 years since some women first won the right to vote. And I think we should do well to remember at the outset of this evening that the suffrage campaign, which was bitterly and sometimes violently fought over many years, was, thinking of the idea of winning, it was a major political victory and the first of many for women in the 21st century. But, and this is where I come to why it's good to be talking in December, I'm not sure you'd know it from the general tenor of commemorations throughout the year. And it may be that when we have discussion afterwards, some of you will tell me that you don't agree with me. But I know that there's a widespread sense, particularly among feminist activists, that an important chance publicly to celebrate and reflect on this important milestone has largely been wasted. Yes, there have been discussions, there have been exhibitions, there have been celebrations, there have been commemorations. I've taken part in some of them in cities and towns all around the country. I was in Oldham last Thursday, for instance, and I was interested and glad to see that the town has agreed in principle to put up a statue in its town centre, which I think has just recently been redesigned, of Annie Kenney, who was a remarkable working-class militant suffragette and deputy leader of the WSPU, which was the Pankhurst wing of the movement. Except that in the land of austerity in which we live, even though we are told by the government that it's over, and let's face it, in the political climate we're in at the moment, pretty well everything looks like it's over, the council has no money. So the plinth stays unfilled, while the local MP, Jim McMahon, has had to lead an online crowdfunder to raise the cash to put a statue on the awaiting base. Now, many think that the generally low-key tone around such an important part of our collective history has been dictated by default from the top. It still amazes me that government set aside a truly measly £5 million to mark the centenary and has had to be constantly prodded and reminded and chased even to spend that money. In an email to me this week, one feminist historian, who is one representative of a range of groups that have put in a bid for funds, claimed that the government has, and this was her quote in the email to me, flat out refused to engage, close quote, and in some cases was only considering bids for events as late as October this year. You know, anybody who knows anything about project management knows that that is sort of sinisterly inefficient. The project, she said, has been run very, very badly, unstrategically and without leadership. And in her view, and this is the bigger political point, this is part of a long failure, she says, to deal with women's suffrage as an idea, instead to try and make it into a nice bit of social history about ladies with hats. But it's not. It was a political movement first and foremost, and that's very difficult for most people to get hold of. She's right. Like so much of our collective and in some ways controversial history, the struggle for the suffrage is too easily reduced to a kind of cartoon strip. Funny women in their long skirts, their high-neck blouses, spied in snatches of scratchy old films, holding banners aloft, marching jerkily down the street. We rarely get a glimpse in this kind of history of the prolonged bloodiness of the suffrage struggle and the deadly seriousness of the protagonists who were quite literally prepared to die for their belief in equality. And yet now, in 2018, of all times, we should be able to recognise and even to identify with such strength of feeling, such political passion, and to understand what it signifies. We are, after all, in the middle of an extraordinary resurgence of feminist activism, a sort of prolonged uprising by women, particularly young women, around the world against both the brutalities and injustices perpetuated against women still, a century after some women won the vote. But it may be that this very passion of today and the breadth of concerns among today's activists is obscuring I'd like to think I'm among them, understanding of history. Today's struggles are so often fought over the sight of the female body and the ways in which it is abused, defiled, and even defined. The suffragettes would understand that as women whose own bodies were frequently violated in their fight for justice, principally through the cruel practice of persistent force-feeding. But to many modern feminist audiences, the principal aim of the suffragettes, the winning of the vote, might seem arcane or even irrelevant. After all, that historic victory has not yet brought civic, political, or economic equality. More generally, we are living in a period of widespread loss of faith in the political process itself, reflected in reduced turnout in elections and the rise of a really ugly populism across Europe and America. It's been a few decades in the making, this disconnection between the people and their political representatives, and it has many interconnected causes. But the Brexit referendum apart, where the turnout matched the high of the 1997 election when New Labour came to power, fewer and fewer people are voting, and the number and percentage of women going to the polls has steadily declined over 30 years. Now, some people might say, what a waste. Millions of women not using their vote. I kind of say it myself. And you might say, is this what the suffragettes fought for? And it's true, I'm often surprised, irritated, and even shocked when out canvassing on the doorstep, I meet women who say with a proud, defiant aggression, what election? I don't know and I don't care. And again, when I talk to young women, often successful in business, who literally have no idea where or what Parliament is, what it does or how it affects their lives. At the very least, that says a lot about the political education in our schools and the quality of our media, and I will come back to these subjects later. But of course, it's also worth asking, what is it about representative politics that fails to engage so many people and so many women? And that too is going to be one of my themes tonight. But I think we should also look at this apparent indifference or disdain among so many women about national politics a little differently, not necessarily as a sign of failure, but as a sign of how certain freedoms have been won, or they feel they've been won, and are now taken for granted. It's also a sign of how much politics is expressed and debated in the cultural arena as much as in the parliamentary one. In that sense, and I am trying to be optimistic tonight, we could say that the century-old struggle for the vote has laid the basis for several distinct strands of women's advance through the century. It is, if you like, the plinth on which so many different kinds of change have been built, from the rise of women's representation within Westminster and other local parliaments, to the growth of female economic power, to the continued vitality of a broader feminist movement. But let's start by looking at Parliament, because after all, that's where the suffragettes wanted to get to. Parliament, that extraordinary and extraordinarily imperfect institution that is, this very week, asserting its ancient power against a shambolic government and ruling party. I may be wrong, but I think many younger people might assume that since women won the vote and the right to become MPs, there have always been women in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. After all, we're used now to seeing women MPs speaking in Parliament or about political matters in television studios, on radios and at public meetings. But in fact, the massed presence of women in public political life is a modern phenomenon. It's a really relatively recent win, if we're thinking about winning. In the election of 1929, the year when all women won the vote and was the first time that women could stand for Parliament, only 14 women were elected out of 601 MPs. It was not until 1945 that 20 women were elected, and there were only 30 women in the House of Commons in 1987. I was 30 in 1987. I find that an incredible statistic. Women did not enter the House of Lords at all until 1958. Now, I well remember what those earlier periods felt like, and I'm sure that there are women here who remember. I was born in 1957, I was a child in the 60s, and I was a feisty young feminist in the 1970s. Despite having been born into a highly political family, and a family with a long parliamentary history, all during my childhood and young life, I considered party and parliamentary politics to be an overwhelmingly male, upper-class affair, formal and highly constrained in tone. Female political figures were rare. Barbara Castle, anyone? I'm looking at people who might be nearer my age. Shirley Williams, Judith Hart, yes, do you want Joan Lester. It's interesting because I remember those names, and I think we all do. We remember those names in a way we don't remember equivalent men of the period. And I now understand what courageous pioneers they were and how hard it was for any woman to be taken seriously in politics. They were continually patronised by their male colleagues. Alice Bacon, who was elected MP for Leeds West in 1945, was told by Herbert Morrison, who was Peter Mandelson's grandfather, incidentally, if you love these kind of political details as I do, to stick to women's issues. Even though Alice Bacon was an expert in education and went on to be part of the government that brought in comprehensive reform. But of course, if she and others did raise women's issues, they were pigeonholed and marginalised, so they could not win. And it was hard for them, and I think it's still hard for women now, to get that balance right. But also hard for those pioneers, early pioneers, to believe in themselves, to feel convinced that they could lead rather than follow. Interviewed in 2009, Shirley Williams, who was, after all, an education secretary and founder member of the Social Democratic Party, which broke away from the Labour Party, spoke about her failure on several occasions to put herself in for leader of either the Labour Party or the SDP. She told her interviewer that while she was always extremely competitive, she lacked that final ounce of belief, ambition and desire needed to reach the very top. Or that's what she thought. She said, "In the end, I quailed at the responsibility of being leader. I didn't think I was good enough." It was only later in her career that she came to understand that she was, in fact, too much in awe of her male colleagues. That angers me. I don't know, I didn't particularly like her politics, but it angers me. So what developments marked the transition from a world where Shirley Williams signified the pinnacle of women's political ambition to a world where a dogged Theresa May occupies the top job with, let's face it, all its appalling pressures and loneliness? I'm afraid you can't get away from it if you're reflecting on a centenary. The first and most obvious answer is Margaret Thatcher, the first woman Prime Minister who broke the mould of self-deprecating femininity in politics. Thatcher certainly proved that women, not all women, were in awe of their male colleagues, far from it. She relished ambition and power and leadership. Not a feminist of any description, Thatcher brought no other women along with her during her time in power. She said she didn't think most women were up to the job of a senior post in politics. And certainly she did very little for women collectively during her time in office. But her sheer nerve, that "I don't care what you think of me," that quality of relishing unpopularity, which is a phrase of Jess Phillips, a Labour MP today, was psychologically really important in the story of women's political advance. And as I grow older, I'm going to admit, I admire that quality more than I did when I was young. And I'm still trying to learn to relish my unpopularity. And I'm not doing very well. But maybe I'll be unpopular as a result of this lecture and I can relish it later. But the second, in my view, actually much more profound development of the post-war period was the rise of second wave feminism and with it socialist feminism. And now there's a term you don't hear much anymore these days. What is particularly interesting in that second wave feminism was that it arose out of women's dissatisfaction with their daily intimate life, with the politics of the home, marriage, family, popular and left-wing culture. It had no immediate or visceral connection to national politics at all. And yet it was a generation of women whose lives were changed by that feminist movement of the 60s and 70s, who went on to have a big impact in Parliament and representation in Parliament, principally through the Labour Party. From the late 70s to the 1980s, and again, this was my generation, women within the Labour Party were demanding things we now take for granted. Better representation, especially women-only shortlists, incredibly controversial at the time, but the single greatest mechanism for getting women into Parliament and positions of power, and now generally accepted, except by the Tory party. They were also demanding gender parity in positions of influence and targeted training in key skills such as speech making and media appearances. A new wave of more avowedly feminist pioneers came into politics in this period. I used to work with Harriet Harman in my first job at the National Council for Civil Liberties, it's been mentioned, and she went into Parliament when I was working with her, and she broke the mould because she campaigned in, I think it was the 1983 election, heavily pregnant with her first child. In that period, Diane Abbott became the first black woman MP to go into Parliament. Even so, when Tessa Jow was elected to Parliament in 1992, there were still more men called John or Jonathan sitting in the House of Commons chamber than there were women. But the 1997 election was a breakthrough of sorts, with a record number of Labour women elected to the Commons, even if they were demeaned by the title Blair's Babes. The journalist Polly Toynbee makes the interesting point that while women or women's issues were not a central pitch of that Labour government, it was individual women, once they got into power and some into political office, who put pressure on key figures in New Labour to push through legislation that affected women's lives. Toynbee notes, for example, that it was ex-single mother Paymaster General Dawn Primarolo, from a Bristol seat, in a key but silent backroom position. I'm not sure why it was silent, but anyway, she was in a backroom post, who pushed the Treasury to calculate the gender effect of all its actions. Toynbee asks, would a figure like Gordon Brown have thought about the specific impact of poverty on women without individual women spelling it out to him? And Toynbee concludes, he wouldn't have. Some of the achievements of that early New Labour period were impressive and a definite win for women in the country. Longer maternity leave, strengthened maternity rights, protection against domestic violence, the establishment of rape crisis centres, many of them now closed down, the establishment of Sure Start centres, now many closed down, and a concerted effort to ensure decisions in the public sector did not discriminate against women, Labour's so-called gender equality duty. Within Parliament, a single creche replaced one of the multiple bars in the House of Commons. They still have far too many bars. And hours of sitting were altered to make it easier for members to balance work and outside life, including childcare. So all of this showed that more women in Parliament, which was part of what the suffragettes wanted, the suffragists and suffragettes wanted, could change the conditions of women in the country for the better, albeit as part of a progressive government. And I think that's just an incredibly important lesson to remember. And the progress made in that period has continued today to some extent in terms of representation. Look at Parliament today and we can see the effect of both Thatcherism in the sense of more women demonstrating individual ambition and nerve, and those collective battles for greater representation. There are now 204 women in Parliament, nearly a third of the members as a whole. And I think it's particularly been interesting to watch the strong bonds developed by women across political parties that are often, to be honest, stronger than the bonds many of them have with their own party colleagues. We can also discern a different tone in politics, which is in part a reflection of a greater informality in public life in general. But for my daughter's generation, women in their early 20s, they can surely look at Parliament and see, in a way that I never could at that age, MPs who look and sound relatively normal. And that matters. Yes, there are still figures like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. To me, they appear ever more farcical. To me, they look like cartoon versions of the men I remember from my childhood. But compare them to the more accessible and yet still powerful figures like Jess Phillips, Angela Rayner, Amber Rudd and Anna Soubry. So far, so good. But we do have to be really careful. A third of women in Parliament is not a half. And imagine if there were 70% of women in Parliament. Why do we always stop at 50%? So there's a long way to go in terms of formal representation. And as Sarah Wollaston, a Tory MP, said the other day on the Week in Westminster, I'm completely addicted to political programmes, but you learn a huge amount from them. When she took her seat in 2010, she was only the 304th woman to be elected to Parliament. And yet in that chamber in 2010, there were more men, there were over 300, there were more men there than had ever been women in the House over the last 100 years. So we're still looking at women breaking through. In Scotland and Wales, where devolution in 1999 seemed to promise greater gender parity, the figures have actually gone down and they're not as encouraging as we might have hoped. Again, about a third of Holyrood's MPs are women, while the figure in the Welsh Assembly is just 32%. Now, it is possible that the rising number of women in Westminster partly reflects the growth of a female elite over the last 20 or 30 years, a very specific group of women that Alison Wolfe tracks in her interesting book, The XX Factor, How Working Women Are Creating a New Society. But really, Wolfe is not talking about working women because women have always worked. She's talking about women working in the professions. She argues that the most significant development of the past few decades has been growing inequality between women, with a small but powerful group, graduates from mostly elite universities who have succeeded in professional jobs, pulling clear of the majority of women who are still marooned in low-status, low-paid work. But I would argue that that elite is important for feminism in ways that I don't think are always fully articulated. For in every area where women have risen to positions of prominence and influence, they reinforce the visibility of women in other parts of the economy, civil society, politics, or culture. So, for example, the growing number of women in the media is a case in point. Look at the number of smart women now who present our news and political programmes, or those articulate figures scary women often, who appear every night on debates about the economy or politics. The growth of this cohort has reinforced and helped develop the growing power of women in politics. Because women in positions of prominence see other women, they recognise them, particularly, in a way that I think men do not. They take comfort from each other's presence, they cheer each other on, and they take each other seriously. And I think it's interesting in the light of this, which is speculation on my part, but I think it's true, to look at the dearth of women at a more local level. The Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR, did a study in 2017 that showed that only 33% of councillors and 17% of council leaders in England are women. And the IPPR called this a democratic deficit. And in the new mayoral combined authority boards, only 4% of members, those with full voting rights, are women, and all 6 bodies are led by men. So the West Midlands, Cambridgeshire, Peterborough, Liverpool City region, the West of England authorities are all without any female members at all. Now, I'm surprised at these low figures, actually, because usually where institutions have less formal power or less money or status, and let's face it, local authorities around the country have been drained of cash, confidence and clout over the past 10 years, you might think that women would be enabled or encouraged to take on a greater role. But perhaps we need to look in another, less obvious direction here. Again, as Alison Wolfe points out, as more and more women have become wage earners, there has been a corresponding decline of women in public life at all levels, particularly in a voluntary capacity. And a local councillor is not a paid job or a career job in the way that an MP is. So I think this is something we need to think about in terms of the future and in terms of the power and influence of women in public life. It's all very well saying she should run, and I would like to see women running for office. But as more and more try to juggle paid work and caring responsibilities, taking on local politics and public service, particularly if it's not paid, is just a step too far. So there are other aspects of the current scene that I think should worry us or we should be aware of. Just because women get into Parliament, it doesn't mean they have the same influence when they get there as their male peers. Just because they hold office, it doesn't mean that they have real power. Sorry to be depressing, but, let's face it. We now have too many examples of women who've been appointed to apparently high-ranking jobs who are still outside the true networks of decision-making. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, even though actually I am, but too many male cliques are still in charge of too much of our society, or they think they are, or they think they should be. I mean, look at the democratic profile of the European Research Group led by Jacob Rees-Mogg. I don't know if any of you saw the newspaper reports. I mean, it was such a statement, a picture of them all, of a certain class, a certain age. They looked like politicians when I was growing up. But some male politicians more cleverly disguise their clannish political behaviour. The coalition was run by a group of 4 male leaders. New Labour was ruled by sofa government, and there were not many women on those sofas. Jo Swinson, the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, has written about how when she became an MP at 25, she stormed into Parliament, or she went into Parliament, full of self-confidence, but completely unaware, she writes now, of the covert cliques and clubs of men who made the real decisions. Another example, when Harriet Harman was voted Deputy Leader of the Labour Party in 2007, and notionally a very important post, she was, rather disgracefully, not made Deputy Prime Minister by the then PM Gordon Brown. And that was a very public and decided vote of no confidence. Gordon Brown, like so many Labour leaders before, and I'm afraid after him, relied on a team of special advisors and chums, most of them men. It's possible that just as in Tudor times, as I learned from my history tutor at university, the very right-leaning David Starkey, but who was a great expert on Henry VIII, that often the greatest influence is exerted by those physically closest to political leaders. And certainly in today's democracy, there are influential women behind the scenes, political advisors of one sort or another, press advisors, relatives or spouses, who have far more real power than many elected women. Who doubts the power of Ivana Trump? or even, when Obama was president, the influence of the marvellous Michelle. Such figures can have an incredible impact on policy and the tone of an administration. And yet, whatever their actual power, the price for a political life can be really high for women. Long ago, Germaine Greer said, and I apologise to the men in the room this doesn't apply to, which I'm sure is all of you, you wouldn't be here, women have no idea how much men hate them. In her book, Woman and Power, Mary Beard, the classicist, notes that the hostile treatment meted out to figures like Hillary Clinton and Caroline Criado Perez, who after all only campaigned to have Jane Austen put on a £10 note and then led for a statue of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, their treatment would be familiar to the creators of Medea, Clytemnestra and Antigone. This has been going on a very long time. And yet it's still shocking, really shocking, to read of, or, as I have had on occasions, to experience such hostility oneself. I was going to read a quote. Jess Phillips, in her autobiography, Every Woman, One Woman's Truth About Speaking the Truth, she paints a really vivid picture of the price of public life for women, from paternalistic shushing, as she calls it, to constant anxiety and abuse about women's appearance. And as she says, I urge you to think about the men and boys you know. Are they knockouts? And the multiple online threats of rape and mutilation. And in Philip's case, an understandable nervousness about conducting constituency surgeries after the murder of her friend and fellow MP, Jo Cox. The thing I was going to read some of the emails that Jess Phillips reproduces in her book. But I read them to my partner, and he said, don't read them. And I thought, but that's the whole point. And he said, don't. They're so horrible. And she describes being late at night, once at midnight, and opening her email, and just dozens of these terrible emails coming in. And I know, because I was stalked on my website, I was stalked by a really unpleasant man who actually had convictions for grievous bodily harm. These things can shut you down. Of course they're going to shut you down, because you're terrified. And even when I involved the police, it didn't stop me being terrified. And this was a really mild example compared to a lot of women MPs. And of course, all of this has been encouraged and legitimated by this ugly misogyny that we now see from many of our world leaders. I mean, who could believe that any woman anywhere would vote for a president who got away with boasting about assaulting women? Who could believe it? I still don't believe it. I don't think I've said the name Donald Trump in this lecture, but I have now to tell you I don't think he needs any encouragement. Okay, I'm sort of on time. But I think we can't, when talking about politics, obviously we can't only talk about Parliament. And it's hard to judge the lasting influence of contemporary movements, but I think we can all agree we are currently living through a really extraordinary resurgence of feminist politics. Now, there are fewer leaders, but there are vast movements, and movements that are transforming our culture. Again, Mary Beard talks about how women are creating new kinds of collective leadership, networks rather than pyramids of power, in part to avoid both the individual demands and the targeted abuse that more conventional leadership attracts. There's no question that these various movements, given great coverage in old and new media, supported and encouraged by high-profile female figures, have galvanised public understanding, particularly of the reality of sexual and domestic violence. Organisations like Everyday Sexism, which highlight ordinary kinds of violence, while the international earthquake that is the Me Too movement is transforming the way that we see men's behaviour. There are some mightily powerful slogans out there, which for me, one of the most powerful is, I believe her. Who could not feel the force and power of those three simple words after hearing the evidence of Christine Blasey Ford in the Senate hearings this autumn? I had flu and I watched every single moment of her testimony. Or reading of the rugby rape trial in Northern Ireland earlier this year. It can feel like a war out there sometimes, and as I say, it's hard to draw up the balance sheet of success and defeat. But on the face of it, it looks like women seeking justice are winning the propaganda war against men seeking to uphold the degrading status quo, but are losing some important official battles where representatives of those men still rule, which is why Parliament's important. After all, Brett Kavanaugh was appointed to the Supreme Court. The defendants in the Northern Ireland rape trial were acquitted. But the story does not end there. It never ends there. The two principal defendants in the Irish trial were sacked by the Irish Rugby Football Union. The Bank of Ireland said it was reviewing its relationship with the team. An independent retired judge, Sir John Gillan, who has said he is inspired by the Me Too movement, was appointed by the government to look at court procedures. And he has recommended exclusion of the public from rape trials and education starting in schools for the wider public and those working in the justice system on the realities and myths of rape. Feminist activists have welcomed his recommendation. So things are changing all the time. Small victories won, small steps taken forward, minds changed, understanding gained. We now grasp so much more clearly the horrors of stalking, coercive control, upskirting, all features of life that when I was a young woman were considered normal, fair play and fun. And laws are now being changed to back up this understanding. These are victories. These are examples of women winning. Now, I may have made this point implicitly already, but let me make it clear. There have always been alliances in women's politics between more powerful women and popular movements. It was true with the suffragettes and the suffragists, and it's true today. I don't think women are so neatly divided or separated as the analysis of someone like Alison Wolfe might imply. After all women understand the threat of violence and coercion at some level. All women know what it is like to be derided or ignored. And what I see around me is that the new female elite, yes, they're part of a picture of inequality, but they are playing an important part in the struggle for justice. I have no doubt that Me Too is as much an expression of women gaining ground as it is of women being ground down in the world of film and television and other media corporate industries in particular. And the same with the BBC equal pay row, which is simultaneously a sign of retreat and advance, particularly the willingness of powerful female media voices to speak up. So that matters. But here, to close my lecture, I want to touch on two themes that rarely get a look in politics these days, and I would argue maybe in feminist politics. One is class difference, and the other is the question of the more ordinary discriminations that exist in most women's lives. Over the past 10 years, we've witnessed the dramatic decline of the welfare state, swinging cuts to public services, and the really cruel, and I use that word deliberately, cruel slashing of welfare benefits. And all of these have had a far greater impact on women than men. Research carried out by the House of Commons Library in 2017 found that women were paying a disproportionate price for helping to balance the government's books, their deficit reduction programme. It predicted that by 2020, men will have borne just 14% of the total burden of those cuts, compared with 86% for women. And here I think we might look at the role of the female and the feminist elite a little differently. Disappointingly, many women in the House of Commons of all political parties voted through many of those benefit cuts that hurt the lives of poorer women around the country. And those who opposed the cuts tended to come from the left of the Labour Party and did not include some prominent feminist voices. Now, they may regret their decision now because everybody's changing their mind about austerity and the deficit. I genuinely don't know, and I'm not here to point fingers. But what is clear is at the time they were following a party and not a gender line. And that's one of the problems and conflicts for women in politics. But it's not just about poor decisions concerning the lives of poor women, who are, after all, one of the most reviled groups in society. It's also about the debates that we're not having and the things we're not talking about. Do you know, I always have such mixed feelings when I read about someone like Michelle Obama visiting an inner London school, as she has done this week, telling pupils they should aim for an elite college. One part of me, the Thatcherite in me, wants to cheer her on for that endorsement of female ambition, because I think women do hold themselves back, and girls do. But another part of me wants to shout out from the back of the room, but what of all the rest? What are they supposed to do? Our educational system has for too long been geared to a talented minority, largely the children of the already affluent, rather than to improving educational opportunities for all young people, and particularly young women, most of whom will not only never get anywhere near places like Yale or Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, Russell Group University or Keele, they will be channeled into caring and catering and all the sort of traditional female occupations. Another question, why do we not hear more about contemporary trade unionism? After all, the TUC is for the first time in its history led by a woman, the terrific Frances O'Grady. I don't understand why she's not more famous, except I can only say she's not more famous because she's a woman. Why do we not hear more about grassroots campaign opposing the social cleansing of areas of London and other cities as a result of unjust taxes like the bedroom tax, surely one of the most disgraceful things ever passed by Parliament, or those women demanding affordable social housing? Where is the policy making and the accompanying fury to lift the burden of care that most women carry throughout a lifetime, looking after children, elderly parents, ill partners, all forms of work that is still not seen as work, despite second-wave feminism making that very case? Where is the outrage about women's pension or poverty? Now, as someone who's worked as a journalist over many years, I also know only too well how hard it is to get coverage for these issues compared to some others. Sex and sexual violence, even though sexual violence has nothing to do with sex, sells papers. Money, everyone's fascinated with money up to a point. BBC editors and executives not being paid as much as BBC men makes headlines. The campaign to get Jane Austen on a banknote provoked massive interest and uproar. The fact that millions of women are still paid £7 to £8 to £9 an hour to look after the elderly is not. That millions of women of my generation have had their pension payments arbitrarily postponed by government as part of deficit reduction, plunging many into poverty, hardly makes the headlines. Another thing that made headline, any kind of row or argument. That's why Germaine Greer continues to have a very thriving public life. Or attention is paid to people like the court case between Katie Hopkins and Jack Munro, the food campaigner. But I think my argument is we need to stay alert to those themes that do not sell papers, that do not make headlines, and do not get onto people's Twitter feed. And my final point is this. 100 years after women won the suffrage, there are many battles still to fight. Around fair pay, around work-life balance, I don't like that phrase, but you know what I mean, around male involvement in domestic life and child rearing. These are all very ordinary forms of gender disadvantage, material, educational and employment related, which will in time affect this younger generation as they travel through their lives. Young women, women of 18, 20, 25. Many whom today thoughtfully check their privilege or rightly flock to the streets to call out "I believe her" may find themselves with little privilege or self-belief as they progress through their own lives. They may already be explaining away some of the ordinary indignities of their young lives, from paternalistic shushing to lack of self-confidence, and of course the two are intimately connected, thinking it now of no great importance, thinking others have a greater need or claim. At the same time, they may be failing to recognise the accretion of small disadvantages as they move through life. The fact that so many of their male peers who went to the same university, got the same degree, will start work on higher salaries. The fact that it is really hard to lean in at work, and much of this is connected to the perennial female need to be liked, which, in the words of two writers, John Edmonds and Eva Tutchell, disempowers. It prevents honest responses. It creates a vacuum. It stunts the development of argument. Young women may not be aware, why would they, that when they have children, as some will, the cost of childcare is crippling. They may not get sufficient help from the state, which is shrinking, or even from a willing partner. They may not be aware as they grow older, unless they have a continuous working record, that their pay will fall quite seriously behind. The gender pay gap, according to Fawcett Society, is 20%. And they certainly will not be aware that if they become single parents, they will see their lives become one long battle to do the near impossible, raise children, earn money, and do interesting work all on their own. And I wonder if many of them many of you who are young, who are here today, will come in 20, 30 years' time to some brutal and basic realisation. I watch this now with women of my age, now in their 50s and 60s, many of whom thought feminism was a fuss about nothing, until the accumulated experience of a lifetime has left them feeling poorer, angrier and disregarded. And I hear them saying now, why did I not speak my mind, take my chances, keep my passion for my work going? Why did I sacrifice so much of myself for marriage or romance or respectability or children? Our daughters' children generation won't say the same things, no generation ever does. But I bet they will wonder why they didn't pay closer attention to the sexual politics of their daily lives. So, can women ever win in politics? I hope, and I'm glad I've got this little ending bit, I hope I've shown that we can chalk up considerable successes so far, but also there are still really a lot of battles to fight. We need to keep pushing for greater and more diverse representation of women in politics, and we need more female leaders because it is really important. We need to keep broadening our view of and campaigns for proper representation. So everything from more women in Parliament, yes, but to more statues, more street names, more banknotes that celebrate women of achievement, to getting more films and TV programmes made about women's lives. I think we need to talk a little less of individual ability, social mobility and success, and more about the general conditions of our lives. One simple thing I learned from my father, the late Labour politician Tony Benn, was that every generation has to fight the same battles over again. There is never any final victory. But I also learned from him and others that each generation will use both new tools and old methods. We know what the new tools are in the 21st century, including the fantastic potential of new technology. But in other ways, politics does not change that much over 100 years. It requires clarity of vision, courage in advocacy, and determination to keep going, whatever the obstacles, and there will always be obstacles. It is these lessons that government could have helped promote in this anniversary year, as well as encouraging younger women to always have more confidence in themselves, their views, and for us all to use our vote. The government may have wasted an opportunity, but we mustn't. It is up to women and men, and particularly those of us in an older generation, to lend our support to the young, to remind them that politics will be a struggle, it will be difficult and sometimes even frightening. The suffragettes knew that. But it is also the most uplifting activity in the world, forging close bonds between strangers, deepening bonds between friends that change a life and last a lifetime. And the campaigners for the vote knew that too. The suffragettes continue to inspire us, and so they should. So what I'd say as we come to the end of this anniversary year, and I'm glad again I'm speaking in December, I want to express a huge debt of gratitude to them, but I also want to express gratitude to the thousands of amazing young women fighting for women's rights today. Thank you.